Hi, I'm David Ridley. My guest is Kynon Ingram. He's the president and general manager for drug maker Eli Lilly in Taiwan. Before moving to Taiwan, he was at Lilly headquarters, where he was vice president of human resources for the worldwide affiliates. He holds an MBA from Duke University. Welcome, Kynon.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me, and go Duke.
Kynon, how is the pharmaceutical market in Taiwan different from the United States?
Yes, that's a great maybe opening question. I would say there are many differences that we could probably go through if we had more time, but I'll highlight a few. Maybe the most notable is just the scale, right? The U.S. market is one that in 2019 was over $500 billion in sales, if you will. And the Taiwan market was just over $6 billion in sales. So you can see there's a massive difference in the size of the market. Maybe a second big difference would be the payer system. The U.S., as you know, has a very complex payer system with many private payers and then a number of also government payers. Taiwan is a universal healthcare system. So it enjoys or works within one payer system where that one payer covers 99% of the population. So effectively you have one payer, one system to work within. Maybe on the commercial side or product side, there's one really big difference I would highlight here, where the U.S. enjoys, if you have a strong product in terms of the value that it brings to patients, the U.S. has kind of a quick uptake with product launches. And then at the point of expiration, patent expiration, you usually have what's called a patent cliff, so a quick decline. Taiwan, on the other side, has a much slower uptake, but what's also called a longer tail or longer product life cycle after generic entrant. And so we find ourselves maybe living at times juxtaposition to the corporate strategy, where the corporation is investing big time in new product launches, and Taiwan is oftentimes trying to secure resources for products at the late life cycle from a corporate perspective. And so that's an ongoing challenge, but also an opportunity in Taiwan where we can have a product to have a longer life cycle within the system. Maybe just from a funnier note, you probably see all the U.S. Drug commercials many of the U.S. drug commercials that are on. And of course, in the U.S., you can have a direct consumer advertising. In Taiwan, you don't. So here you have zero commercials from a pharmaceutical company. So that's just a notable difference that from a commercial perspective, when it comes to trying to create awareness of the products, you operate in a very different way here to create that awareness.
That was a great introduction to the drug market in Taiwan. Thank you.
Yes, no problem.
What mistakes do Americans make when doing business in Taiwan?
Well, I've only been here maybe about 15 months, so I wish I knew the answer. At least then I could probably avoid some of the same mistakes myself. But as I engage with some of the other colleagues within AmCham, so American Chamber of Taiwan, as we have discussions, it seems like the first big thing people tell you, regardless of the sector, whether you're healthcare or any other sector, is don't assume that the knowledge you bring from maybe a larger market, a more complex market or less complex market, don't assume that will exactly fit in Taiwan. And so sometimes it's a human tendency to say, okay, start from the base of experiences you've had and apply those experiences to the new place. This is okay, but you should always remain curious in Taiwan. As I mentioned in the healthcare example, it's a very different healthcare market. So some things from the US will be applicable, but many will not. So one mistake that Americans make is to assume they already know how it's going to work, because sometimes we come from a bigger market like the US into this market. Maybe a second one is not immersing ourselves fully into the culture. And as you do that more and more across sectors and across industries, you get to learn more. You get to understand in a more, maybe a deeper way, what drives some of the consumer behaviors. So I would say even within the Asian culture or within the Asian continent, Taiwan is still unique. And so even maybe some of the preconceived notions we may have, I've spent years working within Asia with China and with Japan. Some of those things are applicable and many are not. So I would say the way to overcome some of those initial assumptions is to remain absolutely curious. And when you think you understand it, still seek to have validation before you act on it.
Why did your company, Eli Lilly, choose you, an American, to lead the office in Taiwan rather than a local? And why did you accept?
Yes, well, I think maybe it wasn't an American versus a local in terms of how the company makes a decision. It's a part of our talent management or talent development model, if you will, where we see as a company people who we believe can lead at higher levels globally. We seek to have those individuals have experiences outside of their home country. So equally, we've had people in Taiwan go and work in the US or the UK. We've had people in Japan go and work in other markets as well. So the idea is to get someone who we see with global potential to work outside of the market that they may be more familiar with. So in my case, our first assignment was in Puerto Rico. The second assignment was in the UK. And now our third assignment is here in Taiwan. In terms of why did we accept, on the professional side, I accepted for those reasons around getting exposure and understanding to complex markets that were unlike the ones I had grown up in, if you will. On the personal side, it was our goal. My wife and I have a wife who's dual career. We've been married 16 years. Actually, we just enjoyed our 16-year anniversary on November 6th. So that just passed. But we've enjoyed a dual career, and we have two children, a daughter who's 12 and a son who's 10. And our goal was to have them grow up as seeing the globe as something they could have access to. She grew up in Tennessee, I grew up in Alabama, and there weren't many global perspectives, at least in our upbringing. So our goal as we then had kids was that our kids were exposed to the world and that would be a part of their life experience. So with Lilly, it has worked out well professionally and personally where we've been able to do both of those things.
It's cool. Very different life experience than what you had for your children.
Yes. Maybe the only commonality when we were in the UK, there was a Birmingham, England, and we grew up I grew up south of Birmingham, Alabama. So it's the same word, just with different pronunciation. But no, we've been very fortunate to be in the various markets between Europe and now Asia and the US. It's given us a great global perspective and given me a global perspective on the pharmaceutical industry.
And for Lilly, it makes sense. It's a good training ground for its future leaders.
Yes, and I should add too, one of my goals as the general manager here of Taiwan is I want a Taiwanese person to be able to take my seat. Maybe if it's not going to be my call when I leave, but I want to make it very difficult to choose another expat, if you will. And so my ultimate goal is to have Taiwanese people competing for my position, but also positions beyond Taiwan at Lilly. And I believe we have the capability. I believe we have the talent. So I believe this is a realistic goal that we can achieve.
Well said. Let's stay on that topic of human resources. Yeah. So you've also had responsibility for human resources for your company in Europe. You mentioned the UK. Yes. How is HR different for Europe than for, say, the US or other markets?
Yes, I mean, the first I would say is Europe is a really big and diverse place, right? While it's known as the European kind of continent, if you will, there are many cultures and countries within Europe. And so the first piece is understanding that within that diversity of Europe, that there's going to be big differences. There are parts of the European culture that are, from an HR perspective, maybe more employee leaning. And there are parts of the European culture from a labor perspective that are more employer leaning. And so one of those contrasts, when you compare it to the US, at times people represent the US as being more employer leaning, and Europe as being more employee leaning. And I think there's some truth in that, but it's not an absolute statement. So I think the first piece is understanding the local European market that you're operating in and the nuances of labor environment in that market. Some markets operate on a consultation basis for any change. Small changes, like if you want to change the type of company car that's provided, you can't do that without consultation and involvement with the employees. Or if you want to change lunchtime offerings. In some of the markets, if you want to change if it's seen as a benefit or a right to the employee, to change it, you have to consult. Whereas in the US, I don't remember being involved in any conversations about the cafeteria offerings. So it's a very different market in that way. What I would say is on the other side, what is very similar is that the European market, many of the European markets, the US markets, they have a commonality around trying to grow the business and grow their people. And so from an HR perspective, this commonality is there. Maybe one other difference I would highlight is in the space of diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion as a word, as a concept, is understood, or maybe something that applies to Europe, but also applies to the US. But the way that it shows up in one country in Europe versus another country in Europe could be very, very different.
Let's stay on the topic of diversity and inclusion. As a leader in human resources, how can you promote diversity in your company?
Wow, great question. I would say, first of all, I grew up, before I was at Duke, I played football, college football, American football, I should say. And I think of diversity and inclusion as a contact sport. I don't think it's anything that you can stand on the sideline and talk about it conceptually. I believe you have to get involved in the game. And if you're comfortable, you're probably not being stretched, so you're not growing. So I think of it as a contact sport where you have to push yourselves to get into spaces of difference and understand them. As a global, maybe citizen, I see it as my responsibility to try to be more open-minded to the world and the differences in how it shows up. So I think the first thing anyone can do, not just in human resources, but I believe if you're in the business of leading people, we all have this responsibility, which is to get involved and to understand and challenge yourself to embrace difference, to be exposed to difference. And with that, maybe friction or maybe that lack of comfort, I actually believe that's a place of growth. And so I think when you're there, then that's when you should keep pushing and keep learning, keep understanding. If you're not there, then you have to challenge yourself to get in spaces where you're uncomfortable or where you're learning again. I think of it a little bit like customer experience. It's a goal that you never actually achieve. People are complex, the world is complex, and it's always changing. So I think in that regard, you should always be working toward learning more and more about people and the uniquenesses that they bring. Because when you do that, I believe you have the chance to unlock the innovation that exists within the differences. I think when you do that, you have the opportunity to understand and help advance those who may not be advancing in the way that they should, simply because of the differences that they may have in their own experiences and background.
Well said. Diversity is context support, and discomfort is a good source of growth.
That's right. That's right. And I think of it, I mentioned, maybe to continue with the sports analogy, if you're working out and there's no resistance in the bar, you're probably not growing. I think the same thing for diversity. If there's no resistance, if there's not some stretch, you're probably not going to get better in that day in that workout. And I think each day we should show up with a curiosity around the cultures that we're in, or maybe the people that we're around, to continue to grow.
You need to sweat a little.
That's right.
The next segment is overrated or underrated. It's a segment I copied from Tyler Cowen. I'll name an item and ask you to say whether it's overrated or underrated, and you can feel free to pass.
Okay, fair enough.
First, Taiwan as tourist destination. Overrated?
Underrated. Underrated for sure. It's a fantastic island of about 23 million people. But with that, every county within the island is on the coast. So you have this huge diversity around everyone being kind of coastal, if you will, in some way. But then within the coast, you have mountain ranges. So you can drive actually Taiwan from the northern part where we live in Taipei to the very southern part. It's about a 7-hour journey. And now to locals, that's a long drive. And they say, oh my God, I can't believe you would ever drive that far. But coming from the US, where I drove 7 hours to get from Indiana to Alabama or to Tennessee, it's not a long drive. But with that, you see the diversity of the country. You can see mountain ranges, you can see the coast, you see indigenous people, you see non-indigenous people. So it's a hugely, hugely unique culture in that you can have everything here as a tourist destination. And then I should also add, the people are super nice, super warm. I personally can't speak Mandarin. I'm trying to learn as quickly as I can. But what you would see here is even without being able to speak Mandarin, usually someone will step in and rescue you. When they see that you're struggling with the words that you have, someone will step in because they generally are warm people who want you to have a great experience. So fortunately or unfortunately, we haven't had the chance to enjoy much of what I'm describing. We had a chance to do a little bit of it with kids' spring breaks and fall breaks, but obviously now with COVID-19 and Taiwan being more under control, we'll have a chance to do a little bit more of that. So we're planning our Christmas vacation now, and we're actually planning to try to explore the eastern coast of Taiwan because most of our time has been spent on the western coast. So I would say definitely underrated and definitely a place that you should have on your list to experience when you can.
Night markets in Taiwan, what are they? And are they overrated or underrated?
Underrated, mostly because they're not fully understood, or maybe even, as you said, what are they? There's not a lot of awareness. I would describe a night market in Taiwan as a mixture of a chance to have a very local consumer experience, whether it be within the culinary experience or even a shopping experience. It's something that's for the whole family. There's games to be played in some of the night markets. And so what you really have is a consumer market that spills out into the street, but it's always there, maybe every weekend. And so from that perspective, you can buy everything from tennis shoes to tofu. So depending on your interests, the night market will have everything for you and everything in between. But it's a really great way to understand the local culture, to be immersed, to understand the foods, the people, the fun, all of those things all in one kind of outing. In each of the big cities, usually you'll have a night market within. And so you'll get a sense, like a place like Taipei has many, many night markets, and each one has a different feel. Some are more family oriented, some are more adult oriented in terms of bars and things like this, and then some are maybe a mixture with food. And so I think if you can get to a night market in Taiwan, it's a great experience to have.
You mentioned food. Food in Taiwan, overrated or underrated?
Underrated, maybe in the same sense because it's not always understood. At least for me, there's some things that are maybe very, very unique. And when I've challenged myself, as an example, in many parts of the world I've lived in, beans are not something you have in dessert. But in Taiwan, beans can find their way into dessert. In some kind of way, the dessert ends up tasting really, really good. And so we mentioned earlier this idea of being very curious where you are. There are some of the foods, when you see them, it may not be immediately attractive to you. Or when you hear them described, like a red bean bun, you say, okay, what is that and do I want to have it? But ultimately, once you try it, it's really good. Taiwan's a great place, a great mixture of cultures where food comes together, taking many influences from Asia, but also outside of Asia, some of the European influences from earlier in Taiwan's existence when European countries occupied different parts of Taiwan.
Red beans for dessert. Where's the chocolate, people? Come on now.
That's right. And there may be some chocolate to be had as well. But yes, red beans for me was a surprise. Red beans can be in a drink, they can be in a dessert, and for sure they can be in a more savory food as well. So I may not be doing the best job of selling the food in Taiwan by saying it's underrated. I think what I'm probably suggesting is that it's very, very diverse and gives a great experience if someone's open-minded to try it.
Train travel in Taiwan, overrated or underrated?
I would say underrated, maybe on the West Coast, overrated on the East Coast. The reason why I separate the two coasts is the West Coast is a place that is more high-speed rail. And so people talk about the efficiency of a high-speed rail, for example, in Japan. What's not always understood is the same type of efficiency exists and punctuality and all of these things on the high-speed rail in Taiwan on the West Coast. The reason why I say not so much on the East Coast is because the high-speed rail doesn't really go to the East Coast yet. So the East Coast is more traditional train travel. The West Coast maybe has more high-speed rail. So it's a little bit of a mixture, overrated and underrated.
Duke basketball, overrated or underrated?
Underrated for sure. Maybe, I don't know if I'm the only person that you may interview that opened with a go Duke, but for sure, I love Duke basketball. And actually when I joined Lilly in 2001, the very first I was a sales rep at the time. The very first kind of leadership book I read and ended up presenting some summary of it to my district sales manager was Coach K's leadership book. And so I remember, this is long before I went to Duke, but it spoke to my early days of commitment to Duke and to Coach K, and that has continued throughout.
My guest today has been Kynon Ingram. Kynon, thanks so much.
David, thank you for having me. I hope that you and your family stay safe during these times. And if I can ever do anything to help you or the university, please let me know.
Likewise. Thank you, Kynon.
Okay, thank you.